Let's begin by reading the text. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief of the officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had ability for serving in the king's court. And he ordered him to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king appointed for them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank, and he appointed that they should be educated 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. Now among them, from the sons of Judah, were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Then the commander of the officials assigned new names for them, and to Daniel he assigned the name Belshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. In the introduction, I noted how many scholars accuse Daniel of historical inaccuracies or of creating tensions with other passages that cannot be resolved. And here in the first verse, we come to an example of one of these issues. And what I want you to see is that many who take issue with Daniel on this point, in fact, do so by dismissing or ignoring possible resolutions to the problem. It says, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Now, the issue here is that Jeremiah 25 says something different. The word came to Jeremiah concerning all the people of Judah in the fourth year of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah, which was the first year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. Now, in Jeremiah 25, Jehoiakim is in his fourth year, and Nebuchadnezzar is in his first year when Nebuchadnezzar lays siege to Babylon, not the siege that destroys the temple, the initial siege in 605 BC, where he just plunders the city, the temple, and takes away some captives. But he leaves the city and its temple intact, and animals are continued to be sacrificed on God's altar. Well, if Jeremiah says it's in the fourth year of Jehoiakim, in the first year of Nebuchadnezzar, well, we have a problem because Daniel says it's in the third year of Jehoiakim. And if it's in the third year of Jehoiakim, then from Jeremiah's standards, Nebuchadnezzar wouldn't even be king yet because it's the fourth year of Jehoiakim when Nebuchadnezzar becomes king. And so what can be done to resolve the discrepancy of dates between Daniel and Jeremiah? Some suggest that Nebuchadnezzar here is only king in an anticipatory sense in Daniel. No one doubts that when Nebuchadnezzar was waging war in the area of Syria-Palestine in the years before 605, he was already declared the crown prince and the field commander. And so the idea is that, Daniel's talking about what he did in his third year, how he came and laid siege as the crown prince, even though he wasn't technically king. And Jeremiah is looking at it from a perspective that's a little bit later on. Now, the problem here is that most historians are going to say that Nebuchadnezzar was in fact king, not simply crown prince, before he laid siege to the city. Now, there are some historians who will get into tricky arguments to try to make this work, but it's not particularly convincing to me. Third or three can be a way of saying not long after the beginning, or a little while, or a few, etc. Three is used in a very generic sense in the ancient world. Think of the Apostle Paul when he says, I prayed 3 times that the thorn in my side would depart from me, but God told me my grace is sufficient for you. Most scholars will tell you that when he says 3 there, he doesn't mean 3 in the most technical sense. Like it couldn't be it couldn't be 2 and it couldn't be 4. It had to be exactly 3. 3 is just a way of saying some or a few. or a little while in the ancient world. Think of Jesus, who says he'll spend 3 nights and 3 days in the heart of the earth. Well, if you look at him as someone who was buried in the evening and rose in the morning, it's not technically possible to spend 3 nights and 3 days in the heart of the earth. He's always going to have to spend more nights in the earth than he does days. He might spend 4 nights in 3 days, or 3 nights in 2 days, etc. But the point is, and language scholars will tell you this, that you're not supposed to take Jesus in the most technical sense when he says three. Three is simply a way of saying some or a few, etc. Now, I don't buy this as an explanation for this passage because you're talking about the reign of a king. To say in the 3rd year of King Jehoiakim, I think, in that kind of context, you should take it technically. We're talking about the years of this king's reign, and 3 is not a generic number in this context. Now, the view I think we're ultimately going to have to go with is that Jeremiah and Daniel are using different schemes. Jeremiah utilized the Judean method of chronological reckoning, which counts the 1st year of a king's reign as his 1st year. And Daniel used the Babylonian system, which accounts the 1st year as an ascension year. So I want to look at a couple of tables to convey this point more clearly. Here you can see Jeremiah's scheme, the Judean method, which actually follows the Egyptian method. And this would make sense since Jeremiah, the tradition goes, he went down to Egypt. Now, in this scheme, Jehoiakim comes to the throne in 608 BC, and that's his 1st year. 607 BC is his 2nd year, 606 is his 3rd year, and 605 is his 4th year, which also coincides with the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. This is, I think for us would be the most natural scheme. Your 1st year of your reign is the 1st year of your reign. However, Daniel may be using the Babylonian method, which does things a little different. Now notice here all the years line up the same way. Jehoiakim still comes to the throne in 608, and 605 is still the year of Nebuchadnezzar's siege, but it's different. In the Babylonian scheme, which again would make sense because Daniel's in Babylon, in the Babylonian scheme, the 1st year is not counted as the 1st year of your reign, it's counted as your ascension year. Right? So 608 BC, that's Jehoiakim's ascension year. And then 607 BC, which is technically the 2nd year of his reign, is counted as his 1st year. You don't actually get your 1st year according to this reckoning until you get your ascension year out of the way. And so then the 606 is his 2nd year. 605, the year of the siege, would be counted as the 3rd year from the Babylonian method, which is the ascension year for Nebuchadnezzar and the year that he laid siege against Babylon. So in these two tables, the dates line up. The dates are exactly the same. They're just discussed differently. The Daniel's reckoning of years is always going to be one less than Jeremiah when discussing a king's reign, because that 1st year is just simply accounted as an ascension year. And if you go with this explanation, some do, some don't, but if you go with this explanation, then you have lined up Jeremiah and Daniel, and in fact there is a resolution here, and no one is justified in saying that Daniel has created an irreconcilable problem in relationship to Jeremiah or in relationship to other historical data. The Lord gave Jehoiakim king of Judah into his hand, along with some of the vessels of the house of God, and he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and he brought the vessels into the treasury of his God. Now, again, this is prior to the sacking of Jerusalem. That's why it says some of the vessels, because other ones were left in the service of the priesthood. So the temple is still standing. You still have a functional priesthood. Now, the word that is used here for vessels is very general, and we can't be sure exactly what one of these vessels are. The word is Kelly, but 2 Chronicles shows us how broad a category this is. It includes pots and shovels and meat forks and all related articles. And of course, in Daniel chapter 5, we're going to see that among the vessels that were taken from the temple include drinking goblets. Now, the Temple Institute has reconstructed many of these vessels in Jerusalem because they hope one day to build a Jewish temple on the Temple Mount. We'll see how that goes. But at the top left, you can see a mitzrak, which is used for catching blood um, for an animal who's had his throat cut. On the left, you can see a kind of a model of the high priest next to an actual altar of incense, which is covered in gold for the burning of incense on the altar. And in the bottom right, you can see an incense chalice. Now, it says Shinar. Shinar is not neutral terminology. This is a pejorative term throughout the scriptures. It's the location of the arrogant building of the Tower of Babel. It is the place of origin for one of the kings who attacked Abraham, and it is the source of the material goods that caused the downfall of Achan in the book of Joshua, and God to curse the children of Israel and to lose a battle in that book. And so when it opens the book by calling this place the land of Shinar, the writer is trying to invoke all sorts of negative connotations. He is revealing that he does not care much for Babylon. He does not respect his captors, at least in the most ultimate sense of respect. He sees Babylon as a moral wasteland, as a sort of den of iniquity. And so right off the bat, we can see that this is going to be resistance literature, at least resistance in the sense of worldview, to show that our captors were not good men, they were not good people, they did not have a good society. But this book is written to expose the evil of this new Tower of Babel, these new oppressors of Abraham, however you would think about this as an ancient Jew when you hear the word Shinar. Wars were fought in a god's name, and plunder thus belonged to him. If you're a human army who goes in and defeats your enemy, you can keep the stuff you find in houses and palaces and buried in the ground. But just as you defeated the people who lived there, presumably your God, the God in whose name you fought, has defeated the local deity of the conquered people. And so he gets his plunder too. When you go into the enemy God's temple and you take the plunder out of the temple, that doesn't belong to you. It belongs to your God in whose name you fought. And so the Babylonians go in, they take some of the vessels out of the Jerusalem temple, and they most likely place it in the temple of Marduk, the primary god in Babylon at the time. And this also sheds some light on why we might have just had a mention of Shinar where the Tower of Babel was, because the Tower of Babel was a ziggurat. I have kind of a classic image here for the Tower of Babel, but it didn't look like this. It would have looked more like a pyramid. Ziggurats kind of have a pyramid shape. Well, Marduk's temple was a ziggurat. So when the Jews go to live in Babylon, they would have looked at Marduk's temple and it would have been reminiscent to them of the Tower of Babel. It says the Lord gave all this stuff into his hands. Now, interesting language is used here. Usually when you come across the English word Lord in your Bible, it is based on Yahweh, which is kind of God's covenant name, the name that shows he is faithful to his covenant, to his people, to his promises. But the word Adonai is used here, which is a word that stresses God's sovereignty, how he is in control of everything. And it seems to be used here in order to emphasize that these people did not defeat our God and take stuff out of the Jerusalem temple because our God was defeated. Quite to the contrary, he is Adonai. These things only happened because in his sovereignty and in his providential goals in history, he wanted them to take these vessels. He gave them to them. So the language is used here to show that Yahweh was not in fact defeated. He is still Adonai. He is still in control. And if anyone is bothered by the fact that these pagans were able to take God's vessels, well, it's all kind of building up to a story in Daniel 5. Because in Daniel 5, someone will deliberately desecrate the vessels that were taken out of the temple, and they will face retribution in turn. So we'll stay tuned for that. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, the chief eunuch. Most scholars think that the language here suggests that he's a eunuch. He's someone who's been castrated in his devotion to the king. The chief eunuch of his officials to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles. So members of elite classes would be taken and educated and enamored with Babylonian ways and customs, and later returned to positions of influence at home. Longman explains this from the Roman perspective, which we'll see at a later point in the book of Daniel, where Rome does this to Greece. He says, for instance, Rome had the practice of taking the children of other close relatives of client states and holding them hostage. This practice was not punishment as much as security against rebellion, as these hostages lived in Rome. A high-ranking Roman family became their patron, and they became acclimated to Roman ways, with the idea that they would be friends of Rome when they returned to their native lands. In the context of Daniel 11, we will note how this was also the experience of Antiochus IV and his brother Demetrius. Okay, so this type of hostage taking works two ways. It accomplishes a short-term goal, and it accomplishes a long-term goal. If you defeat a country and you don't want them to rebel, you take some of the family members of the royal household. In the short term, that is to control your subjects, to say you better not rebel in those territories because I have some of your family members here with me and I can do whatever I want to them. Now, while you have them there, again, they're not in shackles and chains. They're there being educated, being nourished, being taken care of. They're becoming Babylonians. They're being indoctrinated. Or in the case of Rome taking hostages, they're becoming Romans. And so the idea is that after we have taken some of Jerusalem's royal family and turned them into good Babylonians, and they see how much better it is to be a Babylonian, after we've indoctrinated them, we can send them back to Jerusalem, and they will be the vessels of our rulership. They will rule on our behalf, and they will spread influence of Babylon and Babylonian hegemony, and they will solidify our reign in that territory. So that's what's going on here. Daniel and these other folks, they belong to the nobles and to the royal family, and so they've been taken as hostages to be indoctrinated and to eventually one day return to Israel with the hope that they will help to solidify Babylonian rule there. Use in whom was no defect, who were good-looking, showing intelligence in every branch of wisdom, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had ability for serving in the king's court, and he ordered him to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. Now, this has raised a question. Was Daniel castrated as a eunuch? Uh, and one of the main reasons that people believe this is because of this passage in Isaiah. It says, the time will surely come when everything in your palace, that is the palace in Jerusalem, and all that your predecessors have stored up to this day will be carried off to Babylon. Nothing will be left, says the Lord. And some of your descendants, your own flesh and blood, who will be born to you, will be taken away, and they will become eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. So you have a passage here which specifically says the king of Babylon is going to come and take some of the royal family and make them eunuchs in the palace. Well, then you have this story in Daniel of royal family members being taken to Babylon and working in the palace. And so the natural assumption is that they were castrated as eunuchs and that Daniel may have well been a castrated man as well. Now, many rabbis believed he was castrated, but some rabbis argued that because Daniel was identified as being without physical defect in this passage, he was not, in fact, mutilated. Now, this is a difficult thing to say because the evaluation given here is from the perspective of the Babylonian court. The Babylonian court wouldn't have said, well, if we castrate him, he has a physical defect. No, for them, that's an improvement. Because if he has castration, then he can't impregnate any of the royal women and thus infiltrate any of the royal line when he works in the palace. And so the rabbis who said, no, he wasn't castrated, they have this piece of evidence going against them. However, it must be considered that there is evidence that not every man in the court of Babylon was castrated. Many were, but some were not. And ultimately, we just can't know if he was castrated as a eunuch. Most likely he was, especially looking at this passage in Isaiah 39, you would expect that him or at least some of the Hebrew boys would have ended up castrated. It's strange if none of them did. The picture at the top right, of course, is that scene from Acts chapter 8 where Philip has an encounter with the eunuch from Ethiopia. So we can't be sure if Daniel was castrated or not. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. Associating wisdom and virtue with outward appearance. In this passage, you seem to get this association. These guys are good men, they're intelligent men, and they are good looking. And there are a number of passages in the Old Testament that seem to associate these characteristics together, just as there are in lots of other ancient writings. A few examples: Genesis 39 says that the Lord was with Joseph, and then, of course, right after that, it tells us how handsome Joseph was. Or in Job, where the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more after his trial, his time of testing. He prevails. He has more daughters, and of course, it says that his daughters were more beautiful than other men's daughters. Now, when you get in the literature and you come to the commentaries in a passage like this, they'll just tell you there's not much you can say for the ancient biblical writers when they make these types of associations. These are, we would consider these to be very silly, almost comical things to associate together in our time, and potentially dangerous. You don't want to assume that every good-looking person you meet is actually virtuous or trustworthy. And of course, you don't want to assume that every person you meet who's plain looking is automatically evil or unintelligent. So this just seems like a very childish set of associations. But interpreters will oftentimes point out there is another voice in the Old Testament that tries to contravene this, tries to fix this, and eventually wins out in the end. Voices like the one that show up in 1 Samuel 16. The Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." Proverbs 31, "Charm is deceitful, and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord is to be praised." And then in a passage that the early church applied to the Messiah, "For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him." And this passage in Isaiah 53, since it was so influential for the early church, this may be part of the reason why New Testament writers never tell us what anyone looks like, including Jesus, and they never associate wisdom and virtue with being good looking. By the time you get to the New Testament, this particular set of associations will fall away. And there are a number of things in which the Bible changes over time, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. The early books of the Old Testament praise the rich. Later books in the New Testament warn the rich. Early books in the Old Testament seem to be comfortable with attributing a child's sufferings to the sins of his parents. As you move on through the Old Testament, the brakes get slammed on this idea, and other causes are emphasized for a person's suffering instead of suggesting that people suffer for the sins of their parents. You get other things like this. Think, for example, self-righteousness. Right? You can read a passage like Psalm 26 where the writer says, "I've lived a blameless life, and I've trusted in God without failing, and I hate the wicked, and I won't even sit with them to eat," etc. But by the time you get to the New Testament, that type of self-righteousness is altogether excluded. And so what do we do when we find that early books in the Bible have what we would consider to be very childish associations? If a person is rich, they are therefore righteous. If a person suffers, it's because of their parents. If a person is good looking, they may very well be virtuous. What do you do about this? Well, again, I would emphasize that the Bible is a program of progressive revelation, that some of God is revealed in the Old Testament. But as you move along, more and more of God is revealed until you get to the person of Jesus Christ, when God is revealed more fully. And since this is the case, I think that's just something we have to keep in mind when we read certain Old Testament books and we find these childish assertions and associations. We just have to know that's early on in the program. Sometimes ancient people are going to have these ancient beliefs, and as you move closer to Jesus, to the Sermon on the Mount, etc., a lot of these old childish ideas will fall by the wayside. Now, another thing to keep in mind when it tells us that these young men were attractive is that the ancient Babylonian standard of attractiveness is different than the Western standard. The ancient Babylonians liked men who were well-muscled, full-bearded, with luxuriantly curled hair that you can oftentimes find in warriors and kings. And so an artwork on this passage oftentimes looks like on the left. We make them good looking according to Western standards. They have clean shaven faces. They have this real youthful appearance. But what we find in Babylon, the kind of men that that culture liked were these guys on the right, right? These fellas with really curly beards. And so just as we go through this and we look at these different illustrations, we will be able to tell that they are from a Western perspective, but ancient Babylonian people liked men who looked like the fellow on the right. And so it would probably be more accurate to think of Daniel and his friends as looking something like that. Now they were to teach them the literature and the language of the Chaldeans. The king appointed for them a daily ration from the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank, and appointed that they should be educated 3 years, at the end of which they were to enter the king's personal service. Now, a Chaldean education would have included scribal arts, lexicography, the study of natural phenomena, medicine, economics, business, law, government, and religious studies, including myth, prayer, hymns, astrology, and ectisopy. Ectisopy refers to cutting an animal apart and looking at its organs in order to discern a message from the gods. At the bottom right of the screen, you can see Akkadian script. Most likely they would have had to have learned Akkadian. Now, obviously, this is controversial, right? Because these boys are depicted as being good Jews, yet they are trained with a Chaldean education. There's no getting away from the fact that they learned paganism, that they learned pagan religion and mythology, and trying to work out how they could learn these things and still be considered as faithful Jews is obviously a point of fervent speculation. We'll come back to that later. Now, the term Chaldean originates as an ethnic designation for a group of tribes in southern Mesopotamia that rose to political dominance about 20 years before Nebuchadnezzar laid siege. This is the group of tribes that is responsible for relaunching the Babylonian Empire. However, pretty quickly, Chaldean was not just an ethnic or a racial term. It became a byword for any magician or diviner, since the culture was associated with this practice. And so you kind of think of Seattle, right? Seattle in the early 90s was associated with grunge music. Well, there might be a lot of people who made it big in grunge music who were associated with Seattle, even though they, in fact, were not from Seattle. Well, it's kind of like that way with the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans were known for astrology and all these other religious expressions, and so those who who did well in those arts may be called a Chaldean, even though they technically weren't one. They all get new names very quickly. Daniel means God is my judge. He's renamed as Belshazzar, which may either ask for a certain god to protect his life, or it may call on a certain goddess to protect the king. We're not really sure exactly what that name means. Hananiah, which means the Lord has been gracious, becomes Shadrach, which again may mean the command of Aku, which Aku was a Babylonian deity, or it may be the author's purposeful misspelling of the name of Marduk, written as such in order to mock the deity's name. There are a number of places in the Old Testament where they intentionally misspell Old Testament gods' names pagan gods in Old Testament period, they'll intentionally misspell their names in order to mock those gods or to put them down. Mishael means who is what God is, and he is renamed as Meshach, which means who is what Aku is. Or again, others have said that it's a corruption of Marduk's name. And finally, Azariah means the Lord has helped, and Abednego means the servant of Nabu. Nabu was a deity who was the god of writing, right? And so basically, we've taken names, theophoric names, names that make a reference to the God of Israel, and they have been changed to reference pagan gods. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. Now, this is a difficult passage, and it's kind of frustrating that there's never been any explanations proposed for this passage which have persuaded everybody or established a consensus. Why on earth would they be defiled by eating the king's meat and drinking his wine? Well, you might say, well, it's the Torah. It's going to be something to do with the Old Testament dietary commandments. Well, in the Old Testament dietary commandments, every type of food was not unclean, and wine was not unclean. Think, for example, of Isaiah 25, which talks about the Messianic age. On this mountain, the Lord Almighty will prepare a feast of rich food for all peoples, a banquet of aged wine, the best of meats, and the finest of wines, which is, in fact, one of the reasons why even after everybody's drunk in John chapter 2, Jesus gives them even better wine, because if he is the Messiah bringing the Messianic age, the wine cannot run out. And so in the Old Testament, wine is not like this bad or an unclean thing. Now, there are passages that warn you against abusing wine, but in general, you have passages like Psalm 104, which talks about wine which gladdens the hearts of men, right? So you don't want to make the first mistake and say, well, you know, the meat is probably something to do with kosher, and the alcohol means avoiding alcoholism. Now, taking this passage as a jab at alcoholism is something that has been done often in American history. An anonymous poem, which was called Daniel's Band, was written by a member of the early 20th century American temperance movement. Now, the temperance movement wanted to get rid of alcohol, make it illegal, and they succeeded for a period when they passed the 18th Amendment, which made alcohol illegal. And interestingly enough, it reduced alcoholism rates in the United States by 80%. But nevertheless, this comes out of Massachusetts, where it says, in the book of Daniel, we read that when the young Hebrew was offered wine to drink, he voted no. He persuaded 3 of his friends to vote no. Let us all join Daniel's band. Daniel said no, and we will do so. Daniel won 3, and so will we. And so this is, you know, whether or not the temperance movement was a good idea, whether or not they were right, they are definitely misreading this passage. Daniel is probably not taking a jab at alcoholism. Another idea is that it has to do with food that has been offered to the idols. Sumptuous food would be offered to the gods, and after the gods have time to enjoy what they like, the rest would be brought to the king's table. As you can imagine, kings didn't go hungry, right? Because the gods never seemed to eat anything off the plate. But nevertheless, some have said, well, this is why he won't have the king's meat and the king's wine. This stuff has been offered to the gods. Well, the problem here is Daniel does end up eating the vegetables, and there's no reason to believe that the vegetables were not offered to the gods along with the meat, right? So avoiding the meat that was offered to the gods just to eat the vegetables that were offered to the gods, that doesn't solve any of the problems. Some have said it has something to do with mourning, because look at this passage in Daniel chapter 10, where after Daniel receives a certain vision, it says, in those days, I, Daniel, had been mourning for 3 entire weeks. I did not eat any tasty food, nor did meat or wine enter my mouth, nor did I use any ointment at all until the entire 3 weeks were completed. Meat and wine is festival food as far as this argument goes, and abstaining from it is a sign of mourning or penitence and would be appropriate in the exile. Now, this has some possibilities, especially since we can use Daniel chapter 10, a chapter in the same book, to reinforce this interpretation. However, this isn't going to work for everyone because they're in the king's service for 3 years, or excuse me, they're in training for the king's service for 3 years. Well, would they mourn for years at a time? Well, maybe not. And strong language is used that this meat will defile us. Well, that doesn't seem to be warranted if this is a voluntary mourning that we don't have to do. That just seems like strong language for a voluntary mourning period that would have no reason to go on for years and years at a time. So this may not be the best option. The one that most scholars will go with, but it's very tentative, it's not altogether persuasive. The only reason I think we really go with it is because none of the others are all that good. It could be a sign that they have not fully assimilated. In the post-exilic period, not eating Gentile food and not eating with Gentiles became more rigidly enforced as a boundary marker between us and them. So in this view, Daniel has met the criteria of the Torah by not eating certain types of meat, but he himself has chosen to go further by not having the king's wine or not having any of his meat, right? He designs extra measures that are not in the Bible in order to separate himself and his companions from Babylon. Again, what makes this such a potentiality is the fact that we know Jews were doing this at the time. They were not supposed to eat certain kinds of meat. Well, they broadened this commandment to create extra space between them and pagans, and they said, I'm not even going to eat at the table with a Gentile who's eating pork. Right? I'm not eating it, but I'm not even going to eat with a guy who is. And then that went even further until a Jew was not supposed to enter into the house of an unclean pagan. So there are all these extra hedges around the law, all these extra barriers that Jews are taking it upon themselves to create distance between them and Gentiles. Now, is Daniel and his companions doing something like this? It would seem so, right? Because there's nothing in the law of Moses to say you can't have wine. There's nothing in the law of Moses to say you can't have other types of meat. It looks like that when Daniel and his companions initially got to Babylon, they were very concerned about being assimilated into the pagan culture, especially since they were being forced to study pagan religion every day. And so they came up with some extra measures to keep themselves separate from the Babylonians. Now, this may be the best we can do, but again, all these options are very tentative. We can't be sure. Now, God had caused the official to show favor and compassion to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you. Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food. Entreat your servants in accordance with what you see. So he agreed to this and tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them into his service, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. Verse 9 says that God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. Now, this is an intentional echo of the story of Joseph. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him favor and gave him compassion, the same two Hebrew words, in the sight of the prison warden. Why is the story of Daniel being stylized to reflect the story of Joseph? Well, it's because, again, the children of Israel are in uncharted territory, just like they were in Egypt. In Egypt, it wasn't clear what the Israelites' future would be, but God raised this anointed leader to lead them through it. Well, again, they're in foreign territory. They're in Babylon, and God has raised up this anointed leader, Daniel, to lead them out of it. And they are to think of Daniel as a new Joseph, because by remembering God's salvation in the past in Egypt, it gives them hope that they will have a similar salvation in Babylon. And so we want to be sensitive to this as we go. The author is going to draw more parallels between Daniel and Joseph than with anyone else. Right? He's very much concerned to make sure we can see Daniel as a new and, in fact, a better version of Joseph. And the commander of the officials said to Daniel, I am afraid of my lord the king, who is appointed for your food and your drink. For why should he see your faces looking more haggard than the youths who are your own age? Then you would make me forfeit my head to the king. Now here, the idea, it's going to sound a little weird, but it's about having a fat face, right? In our modern Western world, people are eating a lot of protein and fats and sugars, and even poor people have fat faces. But in the ancient world, it wasn't so. Uh, Most of the people in the empire, most poor people, did not consume a lot of sugars and a lot of proteins and a lot of fats. And so they were always kind of thin and gaunt looking. Well, rich men and royalty, they had the money to eat a lot of meat and to eat a lot of fat and a lot of protein. And so they had fatter faces. And this is what this passage is talking about. Daniel and his friends are supposed to be eating the king's meat so that they can have fatter faces, so that they won't look like poor people from the provinces. And the commander is concerned that if you don't end up with a fat face, it might be exposed that I didn't give you the meat I was supposed to give you, and then you'll get me in trouble. So that's the idea here. We want to talk about fat faces. Now, there's a question in the narrative here that Newsom brings to our attention. How is it that the head of staff's words are in fact an expression of favor and sympathy? We were just told that he had favor upon Daniel, and then right here it seems like he didn't really favor him all that much. Daniel made a request, and the guy didn't agree to it. So how, in fact, do the narrator's words make sense that the official has given Daniel favor? As Newsom continues, the head of staff does not agree to Daniel's request, but neither does he deny it. He simply underscores his critical concern. What goes unsaid is the tacit permission the head of staff gives Daniel to work out a behind-the-scenes solution. Now, I do this all the time at the soup kitchen where I work. There's a health code which says we're not allowed to send plates of food out of the building. But sometimes I have these elderly people or people I know are really truly hungry, and they'll ask if they can take a plate home. Well, I can't say yes, right? Because that's against the health code. Instead, what I tell them is, I can't stop you if I don't see it. Now, that's a way of not endorsing that they break the rules, not really, but at the same time, I'm telling them, come up with a solution for your problem, because I, in fact, do want them to be able to take a plate of food. Uh, there's something similar taking place here. The commander doesn't tell Daniel no. He just says, this is why I can't say yes, because I can't end up with my head on a spigot. And so he's basically telling him, hey, go find another way. And that's why Daniel, in the next verse, turns to another head of staff to find a way forward. Now he says, test your servant 10 days. The Hebrew word for vegetable sounds similar to and is derived from the word for seed. All right, seed is zerah and vegetable is zeron. Now, because these words were so similar in the ancient world when the Bible was being translated into Greek, people had the idea, and this became popular in Christian communities for a long time, that Daniel and his friends were not eating vegetables, but they were in fact eating seeds. They were eating pulse crops such as lentils. And this idea was around in Christian history for a very long time. This was the predominant image. And it's interesting that most Christians in history who read this thought they were eating seeds, but this was just based on the mistranslation of a Hebrew word. When we get the original languages wrong, we definitely get the wrong idea in our heads. At the end of 10 days, their appearance seemed better and they were fatter than all the youths who had been eating the king's choice food. Now, this test is definitely the point of the chapter, and the author makes sure we know it. That's why he creates the chapter in this chiastic structure, so that we can see at the center of the chiasm what the point is of the chapter. It begins and ends by discussing the beginning and end of the Babylonian reign over Judah. The second thing discussed is the young men. The second to last thing discussed are the young men, etc. Well, in the middle, it's Daniel takes on a test, and Daniel is triumphant in the test. And so the author wants us to look closely at this test because it's the point. It's what we're supposed to get from the passage. This story in Daniel is responsible for facilitating a classic instance of misreading scripture through Western eyes. And you oftentimes hear that in biblical studies, but this is just such a good example of that. Westerners are very concerned with diet and nutrition because we are a people who consume an incredible amount of calories, an incredible amount of foods and impurities that we should not consume. And so we care a lot about what type of diets work, how do we achieve maximum health and wellness, how do we get in good shape, etc. And we bring these priorities to this passage. Here we have Daniel and his friends. They're consuming a certain type of diet, and they end up with fatter faces and with a healthier appearance than their peers who are eating meat. And so naturally, many Westerners have made $1 off of this, suggesting that the Bible here is revealing science and dietary principles in advance, far back in the ancient world, for the sake of showing us how to eat. Here's one person who's put something together on this. You got the Daniel passages at the top left and the top right, the types of foods that you should eat. There's a statement on spiritual health and prayer, a statement on mental health and how your mind will be better when you get rid of the 130 pounds of sugar that people consume every year. You have physical health concerns such as 80% of the population is tired and sick. Here's another guy, Dr. Axe. He made himself a few dollars off of the Daniel fast. Here's another one from J.R. Rockefeller, ancient diet over 2,610 years ago. And he promises that the Daniel diet is going to give you clear and acne-free skin, and it's going to give your immune system a boost. So what is the problem here? Well, the problem is that an ancient Eastern audience would not have read it this way. Consider the words of Newsom. Despite modern nutritional assumptions, the outcome of the 10 days test is no argument for the health benefits of a diet rich in fruits and vegetables. Although the narrator simply presents the results of the test in terms of the appearance of Daniel and his friends, the completely counterintuitive results would signal to the reader the presence of a power far stronger than Nebuchadnezzar at work behind the scenes. In other words, when a Westerner reads this passage, he makes it about the diet. But when an ancient Easterner would have read this passage, he would have made it about the sustaining power of God. Because for an ancient Eastern person, there is no nutritional debate here. The debate is settled. They're eating an emaciated diet. They're consuming vegetables and water. And when you consume only vegetables and water, you are going to end up thinner than people who are eating meat and drinking wine. They know this. This is common sense. And the fact that they were able to consume an emaciated diet and still end up fatter than their peers means that Yahweh is preserving them in their time of testing. There is no science, there is no nutritional principles, there is no special diet being revealed here. That is not the point. Like I said, the dietary question is settled for the ancient Eastern audience. What is taking place here is God is supernaturally sustaining his people uh, in the face of all established knowledge. They're eating vegetables and drinking water, and they're ending up with fatter faces than their contemporaries. They're ending up with a more youthful appearance than their contemporaries. This is not about diet. This is about God. And so you don't want to take this passage and misread it as, the platform for another American book on how to have an effective diet. That is just not the way to read the passage. And this becomes clear because we have other ancient examples of this. Let's talk about Joseph again. An ancient text, the Testament of Joseph. It says this, I fasted for those 7 years and seemed to the Egyptians like someone who was living richly. For those who fast for God's sake receive graciousness of countenance. Right? You see what's taking place here? It's exactly the same thing. This writer is imagining that Joseph fasted for 7 years and looked like a person who was living richly. In other words, like a person who was eating a lot of food, eating a lot of meat. Why? Because when you fast for God's sake, he sustains you. This is an idea that shows up in other ancient Jewish books. And so, again, notice that the Testament of Joseph is not going to make it about dietary science. That is a Western misreading. And we need to keep this in mind when we read this passage, because here in Daniel, because this passage has been abused by so many people, some who had the good motives of seeking good health, and others who I think did not have such pure motives because they were seeking to make a dollar off of a dietary book. So the overseer continued to withhold their choice food and the wine they were to drink, and kept giving them vegetables. Well, what did he do when he withheld it? Well, obviously, he was going to eat it. You can see him here holding what looks like a big old turkey leg. Now, the Old Greek translation, which goes way back, and in fact, in many cases, may better reflect the ancient Hebrew than the Hebrew copies that we have today. The Old Greek says that he was taking this food to himself. For 3 years, the supervisor receives 4 portions of very high quality food and wine in exchange for much less costly vegetables and water. Now, this goes back to what we were talking about in the introduction, that the book of Daniel is going to show us how schemy people are who live in the palace. We can do things in secret together. So long as you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, etc. Daniel is always trying to show us that that is what a pagan palace is like. So we're getting to see how selfish people can be who work in Washington, D.C., as it were. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. Now, as we pointed out earlier, Daniel had to learn the Chaldean pagan arts, and this has raised the question, how did these Jews stay so faithful despite the fact that they had to be educated in pagan things? I mean, how does that even work? They are just covering themselves in pagan religious learning, despite the fact that they're Jews, and the author seems to be okay with this. And this raises for us several questions about Christ and culture. Many commentators on Daniel make reference to Richard Niebuhr's classic study on Christ and culture, where Richard Niebuhr raised 5 different types of approaches that Christians take to culture. And I think it would be good for us to briefly discuss these 5 and invoke these categories as we go throughout the book of Daniel. One approach to culture has been Christ against culture. Now, there's some of this in the book of Daniel. Obviously, the entire book of Revelation is an expression of Christ against culture. This shows up many places in the Bible. And we have many examples of this in Christian history. In recent Christian history, think of parents who withdraw their children from the public school system and homeschool them. This is an example of Christians who are against culture. Or think of Mennonites who go and start their own towns and villages so that they can be disconnected from larger society. Obviously, they have a very negative view about the culture. And there are a number of Christians who think that this should be our default way of getting around. Now, I'm not at all discounting the legitimacy of this perspective. I think this is right in many contexts, but maybe it's not right in every context. For example, we are to be in the world but not of the world. How can your children learn this from homeschooling, right? They're not of the world now that you're homeschooling them, but they're not in it either. How are they going to be a light shining in the darkness if you literally separate them from the proximity of unbelievers? And so I think there is a time for Christians to be against culture, but it's not all the time. And we can certainly see here in this passage that Daniel and the three boys, uh, they're ambivalent about the culture. They want to stay away from it in some senses, but at the same time, they did go ahead with this learning program and they learned the Chaldean pagan literature. So they can't be fully against culture on every level. Another perspective is the Christ of culture, which I don't trust at all. This view basically says we have in culture what we want, and now we need to take Christ and dress him up in the image of our culture. In our time, this often comes through as the social gospel or as certain forms of liberal Christianity, where Christianity is all about sharing and social justice and engineering a Christian message that accommodates the culture and offends no one. I don't really have much I can say about position number two. I just think this view is probably wrong every time it shows up. Another one is Christ and culture and paradox. All right. In this model, church and society have separate but legitimate spheres. We obey Christ in the church and the political leaders in our public community life. Uh, and this is one Christians do a lot in a number of ways. I heard a liberal Christian say, I don't believe in abortion. However, when I vote for pro-abortion candidates because I think that there are many non-Christians in our society. There are many people, they should be able to follow their own conscience. Now, my Christian conscience is personally against abortion, but, but that's my personal life. In public life, in a democracy, I'm going to vote for abortion to be an option because other people need to be able to follow their conscience like me. That's an example of Christ and culture and paradox, where you have a private Christian identity and then you have a public national identity, and these two do not overlap. Conservative Christians also believe in a type of Christ and culture and paradox. Think of Martin Luther and his two kingdoms model, where he said the Sermon on the Mount applies to you as a Christian in your personal life, right? So you are supposed to bless your enemies and to not harm them. However, in your public national life, you can kill your enemies, you can kill your national enemies when you serve in the war, or you can kill people in terms of capital punishment. Martin Luther said there are two kingdoms. In your personal life, you belong to the kingdom of Christ, and the Sermon on the Mount applies. And then in the national kingdom, you belong to the state, and the Sermon on the Mount does not apply to you. Now, this perspective has oftentimes been criticized as leading to the atrocities of the Nazi regime. There are many Christians who, in their personal life, objected to what was happening to the Jews and in other groups, such as the Gypsies, but in their public life, which they had been taught is different, they thought they could do these things innocently because they adopted this view of Christ and culture in paradox. You have a personal Christian identity, and then you have a public national identity, and they do not overlap. Christ above culture. This view says that Christ is the fulfillment of ideals that culture perceives but does not achieve. You can imagine maybe the Hebrew boys telling Nebuchadnezzar, yes, we like this story where Marduk creates the world out of watery chaos, and then he creates human beings to be slaves. But in fact, this is not the best version. The best version is Yahweh, who creates the world out of watery chaos and then creates humankind not as slaves, but as image bearers, people who represent his divine and kingly authority on the earth. And you can see this, with certain types of soup kitchens. There are many Christians who say, we like secular soup kitchens. Hungry people need a meal. However, simply feeding people is not enough. You have to give them the gospel as well. And so they separate and they create these Christian soup kitchens where people eat, plus they receive the gospel. And Christians involved in those soup kitchens look at the secular soup kitchens as doing something good, but something that is ultimately going to be ineffective because it does not aspire to Christ. And then finally, you have Christ as the transformer of culture. Uh, Working from within the culture, Christians operate as agents of positive change. Now, these are the folks who are going to say, no, let's not start a Christian soup kitchen. Let's go get involved in community soup kitchens. Let's go work alongside atheists, and let's work alongside secular and non-Christian people. And let's be fully engaged in politics, and in all the negative aspects of culture. And hopefully we can transform the culture through Christian influence, and in some level, the culture can become an extension of the kingdom of God. And so these are 5 different perspectives, and they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. You don't have to pick one and reject all the others. Maybe the best approach is a combination of different ones, or you can ascribe more to one view under certain circumstances than others. But I want to put these 5 on the table so that perhaps we can invoke these as we go throughout this study, because we're not going to find that Daniel is always an instance of Christ against culture. Sometimes these other elements show up as well. We end by discussing another alleged contradiction between different passages in the book of Daniel. This verse says that Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king. And of course, Cyrus was the king of Persia. Daniel chapter 10 says, in the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a message was revealed to Daniel. Well, if chapter 1 says he continued until the 1st year of Cyrus, and if chapter 10 says he was still going at it in the 3rd year of Cyrus, how do you resolve that contradiction? Well, most likely you resolve it by understanding that the statement that he continued until the 1st year of Cyrus the king doesn't mean he dropped dead or retired at precisely that point. As Golden Gay says, Daniel's continuing at court after the 1st year of Cyrus is neither implied nor precluded. The point is Daniel outlived the exile. This chapter begins by discussing the beginning of the Babylonian exile, and it ends by discussing the end of the Babylonian exile. And Daniel, as well as the other Jewish exiles, they have outlived the Babylonian exile. The Babylonian exile did not kill them. It did not destroy them. They did not lose their Jewish identity by assimilating into the general population. And the point of saying the 1st year of Cyrus is this is the year when the exile ends. We lasted until that point. We outlasted the time of our slavery and our captivity. Now, think of this. The whole point of this chapter is divine sustenance, God sustaining his people in their time of trial and testing. Just as God sustained the Hebrew boys during their period of trial with their emaciated diet of water and vegetables, so God sustained the entirety of the nation in their time of trial in Babylonian exile. This is why the chapter begins with the date of the exile's beginning, ends with the date of the exile's close, and puts a story of Hebrew boys being sustained by God for a set period of time in the middle, right? It's a story within a story. The story of God miraculously sustaining the Hebrew boys points to the much larger story of God sustaining the Jewish exiles for the full duration of the Babylonian exile. And so that's why the chapter begins and ends with the start and end dates of the exile and sticks those Hebrew boys being sustained by God in the middle, because this is one big story. The exile is one big story about how God sustained his people in their time of trial. And that smaller story of the Hebrew boys sort of points to that. It sort of symbolizes the larger Babylonian exile. And so this is why this chapter is going to say Daniel went until the first year of Cyrus the king. The point is he outlived Nebuchadnezzar. He outlived Belshazzar. He outlived all the tyrants of Babylon. And he achieved unto the first year of Cyrus, where the exile begins to end and Jews begin to go back home to Judea and to Jerusalem. And so I think to take this verse and to play it off against chapter 10 to create a contradiction is just basically to misunderstand the point of this chapter and the point of mentioning the first year of Cyrus. Cyrus is mentioned because the first year of his reign is important for Jews as a new era in which they get to go home and the exile is brought to an end. So the first chapter is sort of a preamble. It teaches us how to think about the rest of the book. This whole book is about how God sustains his people in exile. And so now that we've seen the beginning and the end of the exile in the very first chapter, we will now go into other chapters and other stories that examine things that took place in the exile and prophecies that came during the exile in much more detail.